California Governor Ronald Reagan emerged as the Republican candidate for president in 1980. A former Hollywood actor, Reagan knew how to use the media. He was charismatic in front of a camera, good-looking, polished, and articulate.
I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
Reagan was a political conservative, the most conservative Republican to run for president since Barry Goldwater lost to President Lyndon Johnson in the election of 1964. Reagan believed in a sharply reduced role for the federal government. He opposed most government social welfare programs, contending that personal initiative was the key to an individual's success. Many of Reagan's supporters, among them blue-collar union members who had formed the backbone of the Democratic Party, were angry about the years of change in the U.S., a period that included an increase in illegal drug use, a rising crime rate, and the continuing youth rebellion. They agreed with Reagan's notions that a return to traditional values was needed, and that large-scale government programs and liberal court decisions were behind much of the social upheaval in the U.S.
The traditional constituency of the Democratic Party had been breaking down through the decade of the 70s, and Reagan would appeal to ethnic, white, working-class voters in a way that Republicans traditionally had not before.
Ronald Reagan's promise to strengthen America's military and his strong stand against the Soviet Union also appealed to many voters. The Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 had brought relations between the United States and the Soviet Union to a standstill. Reagan was strongly opposed to communism in general and skeptical about any kind of meaningful relationship with the Soviet Union, which he referred to as the evil empire.
But I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Elected in a landslide over President Jimmy Carter, Reagan's ability to put across his ideas earned him the title, the Great Communicator. At a time when many Americans felt the country was in decline, Reagan brimmed with self-confidence, optimism, and a sense of humor, even after narrowly surviving an assassination attempt early in his first term. As president, Reagan moved quickly to implement his economic programs. To stimulate the economy, Reagan adopted a philosophy called supply-side economics, the theory that steep tax cuts, particularly for the wealthy, would encourage more saving and investment. It was also known as trickle-down prosperity. If businesses grew unhindered by high taxes, the theory went, wealth would trickle down to the people in lower tax brackets through the creation of new jobs. This policy came to be called Reaganomics. To combat high inflation, the Federal Reserve Board, an independent government agency that controls the supply of money in the U.S., began raising interest rates. The Federal Reserve's plan did help control inflation, but the economy slowed so much that by the early 1980s, America was experiencing the worst economic slowdown or recession since the Great Depression. By 1983, the economy began to recover, and inflation and unemployment were under control. Reaganomics seemed to solve some major economic problems, but it caused another. The federal deficit grew dramatically. The government had slowed the growth of spending on social programs, but massive tax cuts, combined with increased military expenditures, meant the government was still spending more than it was taking in, and the government began to go deeper and deeper into debt. Despite the growing budget deficit, the economy continued to recover throughout Reagan's second term. Another way Reagan hoped to stimulate the economy was by cutting back government regulation of industry. With less regulation, Reagan believed, businesses could be more profitable. The Reagan administration focused much of its deregulation efforts on the transportation and banking industries. His administration also moved to cut back on environmental regulations, arguing that many of them were bad for the growth of business. President Reagan appointed 3 judges to the Supreme Court. including the first woman justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. He also appointed Justices Antonin Scalia and Anthony Kennedy, appointments that reflected Reagan's conservative philosophy. This marked the end of a long period of court decisions expanding individual liberties that had begun during Roosevelt's New Deal. Ronald Reagan's commitment to ending big government slowed the growth of government spending on programs like welfare and job training, while out-of-pocket expenses for Medicare recipients increased. In addition, the president drastically reduced direct federal aid to states and cities.
The major cities suffered under Reagan. They had become accustomed to large amounts of federal aid, and this was withdrawn. So to the extent that there was a crisis of the cities during the 1980s, this was exacerbated by Reagan's policies.
While the cuts affected almost everyone receiving government support, they fell most heavily on single women with children. The combination of a tax policy that generally favored wealthier Americans, high unemployment, and reduced federal welfare dollars led to a widening gap between rich and poor. At the same time, crime rates, which had begun to rise in the 70s, continued to climb, especially in America's inner cities. As drug use and drug dealing increased, President Reagan pushed for tougher federal drug laws, a policy that, when adopted by states across the country, led to a dramatic increase in the nation's prison population. A strong anti-communist, President Reagan was determined to confront, rather than to seek accommodation with, communism around the globe. Believing the U.S. was falling behind the Soviet Union militarily, he greatly increased defense spending. That frightened some Americans, who joined the nuclear freeze movement, calling for a halt in the growth of nuclear arms. They joined a huge protest in New York City in 1982.
Certainly, there were grounds for fears of nuclear war, or at least nuclear escalation. This was a period where stockpiles in the United States and the Soviet Union, as many critics argued, could blow up the world many times over.
Partly to diffuse that protest and partly to protect America from nuclear missiles, President Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, a system that was dubbed Star Wars, since it would be based partly in space.
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
The theory was that SDI would intercept Russian missiles at various phases of their flight before they got to the United States. Critics of SDI cited the program as being too expensive, unworkable, and inappropriately extending the arms race into space. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, the Star Wars program had barely gotten off the ground. To prevent the spread of communism in Latin America, President Reagan sent U.S. troops to the island of Grenada to halt what he said was a Cuban-backed revolt. Despite a congressional ban, he also supported the Contras, rebels fighting a pro-communist government in Nicaragua. It was later revealed that money to fund the Contras had come from secret arms sales to Iran in an effort to secure the release of American hostages. The Iran-Contra affair, as the scandal became known, was the most serious political crisis of the Reagan presidency. Despite the damage to Reagan's public image from the Iran-Contra affair, his strong stand against communism remained popular with the American public. Visiting the divided city of Berlin in 1987, he challenged Soviet leader Gorbachev to strike a blow for peace.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
By the end of his presidency, it was clear that Reagan's stance against the Soviet Union was paying off. Many believed that his decision to dramatically increase defense spending hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it could not match U.S. spending. President Reagan began a conservative revolution almost as thorough as the liberal revolution launched 50 years earlier by President Roosevelt. He slowed the growth of the federal government, convincing many Americans that the government was not the answer to all of society's problems. Supporters pointed out that this policy of less government led to the creation of 118 million new jobs, although critics pointed to the increased gap between the rich and poor and the decline of the inner cities. Elected in 1981, President Ronald Reagan revived the black and white rhetoric of the Cold War, often referring to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Reagan also applied his anti-communist beliefs toward Latin America. The United States had long considered South America to be part of its sphere of influence. Now, Reagan regarded any movement away from America's influence as communist. He strongly supported a military-backed regime in El Salvador by funneling billions of dollars in aid against a leftist reform movement. In Nicaragua, after a revolutionary group called the Sandinistas overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator in 1979, Reagan backed a conservative rebel group called the Contras with weapons and money. Congress opposed Reagan's policies and banned military aid to the Contras. Nevertheless, the Reagan administration continued the operation in secret, diverting money made from illegal arms sales to Iran to fund the Contras. The scandal became known as the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan also vowed to make America's military strong again, pledging, "We must find peace through strength." The cost of building up the military was tremendous. Over a 5-year period, the United States spent $1.5 trillion on defense and helped create a huge budget deficit. Reagan's stepped-up defense spending included funding for the partially space-based Strategic Defense Initiative known as Star Wars. To prevent the U.S. from gaining a military advantage, the Soviets tried to match U.S. defense spending. Already plagued with problems, however, the Soviet economy could not sustain the increased expenditures. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev knew that he could not repair the collapsing Soviet economy without cutting down on military funding, and in 1985, he began a series of summit meetings with President Reagan. In 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, or INF, an agreement to dismantle short and medium-range nuclear missiles. In 1987, President Reagan visited an economically vibrant West Berlin. He stood at the Berlin Wall and challenged Mikhail Gorbachev.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Gorbachev seemed to be moving the Soviet Union in a different direction than previous Soviet leaders. He instituted glasnost, a policy of political openness. Under glasnost, people could speak openly about problems in the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev instituted perestroika, a restructuring of the outdated and failing Soviet economy. Perestroika allowed for limited free enterprise in Russia. The spirit of glasnost and perestroika stirred the people of Eastern Europe to end communist regimes peacefully. Thousands of East Germans went to Czechoslovakia, hoping to get visas to go to West Germany. Then East Germany, the most rigid and tightly controlled of all the Eastern European countries, began to stir. First, the East German leader was forced out of office, and then his successor ordered the opening of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. Days later, dismantling of one of the most infamous symbols of the Iron Curtain began. Within a year, Germany was reunited under a democratic government. President Gorbachev's efforts to keep the Soviet Union intact failed, and by the end of 1993, his successor, Boris Yeltsin, had overseen the dissolution of the Soviet Union into 15 separate nations. The Cold War was over.
The economy bogged down in the 1970s because oil is such a key input to so many things in the U.S. economy. And we had two different oil shocks, both caused by the OPEC cartel. As they were able to raise prices, there was a significant increase in input costs throughout all of the U.S. society. And that increase is what really led to a stagnation in the economy.
President Jimmy Carter believed the energy crisis required Americans to change their consumption habits, but his message of conservation and sacrifice was unpopular with the American public.
Our decision about energy will test the character of the American people and the ability of the President and the Congress to govern this nation.
I think people still had reasonable expectations that the government would be a driver in their economic prosperity. They really weren't clear what private sector solutions might be. And there was a sense, I think, in part of the late 70s of panic. When you looked at the hostages that were being held, our sense of our national preeminence being challenged, and how that fit into the economic picture, the major inflation and the lack of growth, you had a situation of national frustration.
Time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden.
When Ronald Reagan promised a pain-free recovery, American voters sent Reagan to Washington and Carter home to Georgia. Reagan's solution was supply-side economics, also known as trickle-down.
Trickle-down economics suggests that if you give a bonus to people at the top, they'll trickle it down to folks at the bottom. So in other words, if I cut corporate taxes, corporations will invest in machinery, which will then cause them to hire more people because someone has to work the machinery.
If you're making the wealthy better off, that's going to increase investment, maybe generate more new businesses. And with those new businesses and the additional investment, it will move down in terms of creating more jobs and higher salaries for people within the economy.
It's a leap of faith. If you work on the supply side, you invest on the supply side, then things will happen on the demand side.
Reagan's supply-side theories were similar to those that had been in vogue during the 20s, prior to the Great Depression. They contradicted the Keynesian theories of the New Deal.
The big thing in Keynesian economics was to move the focus away from the supply side to the demand side. The reason that we saw a lot of the New Deal programs was just getting income in people's pockets. If they started to have jobs and got income, then they would spend it. Whether they were buying groceries or they were buying clothes, all of these are going to create jobs. And if businesses are actually seeing some spending, then they can hire some more workers in order to take care of those customers.
The bubble-up New Deal kind of economics created all kinds of economic drivers for people at the bottom that had never existed. So the poor were empowered. People of color were empowered. I think there was a real resistance and almost a pushback on some of that. When you think about it, how do you shift from bubbling up to trickling down? And I think part of that is about you don't like what bubbles up, but you can control what trickles down.
We think the time has come where there has to be a change of direction.
A cornerstone of Reaganomics was the Laffer curve.
The Laffer curve exhibited a relationship between income tax rates and income tax revenue, and essentially said that during the early period, if you raise tax rates, you raise revenue, but we get beyond a point where if tax rates are higher than that, tax revenue will actually go down. If you were above that point, you could actually lower tax rates and increase tax revenue. And from a politician standpoint, cutting taxes and being able to spend more is ideal. Normally, to keep a balanced budget, if you cut taxes, you have to cut spending at the same time. But believing that through the Laffer curve, you could cut taxes without cutting spending, we essentially created a bigger deficit during that time period. So we were spending our way out of a recession.
There are more poor than ever, more families in trouble, more and more people who need help but can't find it.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Reagan believed that business was overburdened with taxation and government regulation, and that the forces of capitalism should be unleashed to operate in a free market.
We're a very different company today than we were 5 years ago.
On the positive side, deregulation does cut down the cost of doing business. The thing that we find on the other side, though, is that deregulation increases competition and removes some of the safety nets that come from regulation.
Now I gotta cut loose, foot loose, kick off the Sunday shoes.
I consider the Watt-Lujan bill to be the negation of the concept of wilderness protection.
Deregulation allowed for greater competition and often led to lower prices, but provided less federal supervision, including less protection of natural resources. In the marketplace, the removal of constraints on business led to a free-for-all atmosphere of corporate mergers, hostile takeovers, and financial schemes that made millionaires overnight. By the late 1980s, many of the stories of financial success had turned to corruption and scandal.
What's extraordinary is what these crooks and high rollers have been doing and why the regulators have let them get away with it.
About a third of the nation's savings and loans are on the verge of collapse.
The deregulation of the savings and loan industry had given small banks the freedom to gamble with depositors' funds and led to the biggest scandal of them all.
The savings and loan debacle of the 1980s is at least partially a function of governments stepping back from its regulatory role in banking. Federal government reduced the oversight in terms of the kind of loans that were granted. And then when these loans began to be called, people didn't have the money. We ended up with investors, seniors, pensioners, who lost their life savings because of this. It really raises questions about why we need regulation for capitalism. Capitalism is not a system that works smoothly, reasonably, and fairly without oversight.
New Deal protections helped to protect depositors and avert a more serious financial crisis. But American taxpayers ultimately paid the price. The results of Reaganomics were a mixed bag. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. The economy expanded, as did the national debt.
We were able to get out of the recession, and we had an extended period of economic growth, but we were financing a lot of that through deficit spending. Running deficits to try to pull an economy out of a recession was not something that was unheard of. But the thing that we saw all through the 80s and 90s was that we continued to run the budget deficit during the expansionary periods. And so we added a substantial amount to the debt that existed.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
I think all Republican administrations are going to lean more toward the tax cuts than they are additional government spending. We're trying to stimulate the economy. That kind of came out of Reagan and has continued through most of the Republican administrations that have followed him.
All right, quiet on the set.
In 1980, former movie actor Ronald Reagan swept his way to the presidency, beating incumbent Jimmy Carter in 44 states. Coming on the heels of the bad news-laden Carter administration, Reagan's flag-draped conservative rhetoric had a strong popular appeal.
Ronald Reagan was indeed that patriotic, did indeed have that view of America as something out of a 1930s movie.
Number 40, Ronald Reagan, Republican. 1981 to 1989, 69 years old, from California. So far, Ronald Reagan is the oldest president ever to be elected, and even to those who served on his staff, he's one of the most unlikely.
I always assumed that the brightest person made the best leader. And Reagan was not the brightest person in the country, but he was a terrific leader.
Reagan enjoyed his time in the Oval Office, whether feeding the White House squirrels or sharing a weekly Mexican lunch with Vice President George Bush. Reagan's First Lady, Nancy, had great influence over him, sometimes planning his appointments based on advice from her astrologer. President Reagan had few close friends, but he was well-liked in Washington.
He was the life of the party, and the person he was likely to enjoy most would be the one with the most new dirty jokes.
The nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. I'm speaking to you tonight.
Known as the great communicator, Reagan knew how to strike just the right chord in times of crisis.
Nuclear destruction.
The defining Reagan moment for me was the Challenger disaster.
Challenger, go and throttle.
Ronald Reagan exhibited that quality that I call the chief soother.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Even when he faced down the bullet of a would-be assassin, Reagan projected a calm that reassured the country.
When I saw all those doctors around me, too, I said, I hope they were all Republicans.
It was that humor when he was shot that I think endeared people to Reagan and also gave them a sense, this is a strong, tough fellow. I think it was the transforming moment in his presidency.
Ronald Reagan's management style reflected his Hollywood training. He was the star, and it was up to the rest of the crew to keep the production running smoothly. This led to the perception that he was a puppet.
He was certainly not a puppet. He made all the decisions. He could be disengaged from the details of policy.
Reagan was also rumored to fall asleep in cabinet meetings.
The suggestion that he went to sleep in cabinet meetings is ludicrous. I've got a wonderful doodle out here that he did that says, "Dear Jim, you see, I don't sleep in all the cabinet meetings. Sometimes I do this." And so he was able to poke fun at himself.
But Reagan's lax management style may have led to the darkest episode of his presidency, the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan denied knowledge of the illegal scheme that funded anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua with proceeds from covert arms sales to Iran. With most presidents, such a claim would seem far-fetched. But in Reagan's case, it was entirely plausible that he was out of the loop.
There were a lot of people at that time, particularly in the National Security Council, who were going around, running around doing things that I'm quite confident the president didn't know about.
In the end, Reagan avoided criminal charges in the Iran-Contra affair, although he did accept responsibility. Sort of.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
While he was forced to backpedal on Iran-Contra, Reagan never wavered from his core beliefs.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Reagan had an almost religious devotion to shrinking the size of government, building up the military, and lowering taxes. His economic plan led to a boom in the 80s and record deficits in the 90s.
Reaganomics is built on the theory that you don't have to worry about the future. You can cut taxes, you can raise spending, you can raise defense spending, and ultimately you don't have to worry.
Of course, you've got huge deficits, but Reagan was doing this philosophically. He wasn't doing this as an economist.
Enough Americans believed in the rightness of Reagan's policies that he was re-elected overwhelmingly in 1984. In his campaign that year, he trumpeted the return of domestic prosperity, declaring it was morning in America.
It was a lot of rhetoric. It's the notion that you wave the flag and celebrate American virtues and turn a blind eye to failings.
Reagan, Reagan.
Overlooked in Reagan's rosy view of America were issues like AIDS, women's rights, and homelessness.
It's understandable with Reagan because he doesn't believe in using government for social engineering.
But the cornerstone of Reagan's legacy, and any claim he might have on presidential greatness, is the notion that his leadership won the Cold War for America.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
The struggle to contain and then stop the spread of Soviet communism begins, of course, with Harry Truman and goes through all of the presidents. But what Ronald Reagan does is he makes it into a moral thing. He says this is an evil empire. It's going to collapse.
Communism is another sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages even now are being written.
Using his strong rhetoric as political cover, Reagan was able to take a softer approach with his Soviet counterpart when the opportunity presented itself.
Reagan, to his credit, sees that in Gorbachev, he has someone he can negotiate with. And Reagan seizes upon that. They have 4 summit conferences, summit meetings, and this does move the Soviet Union along the road toward the collapse, which occurs in 1989, 1990.
When Reagan went to Geneva for the first of his summits with Gorbachev, aides were worried that the president would be overmatched by the more detail-oriented Soviet leader. Gorbachev, a former engineer, was reputed to be a master of the intricacies of geopolitics and weapons systems.
But they became fast friends. They met in Geneva, 4 hours of talks. And I finally got the nerve up to ask Reagan one time at a little private dinner. I said, you know, you weren't a detail man. I said, how'd this happen? I remember Reagan looked at me and said, oh, Hugh, he said, he didn't know any of that stuff either.
In 1983, Reagan unveiled what was to be one of the most bizarre presidential initiatives of all time.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
The Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, was largely a product of Reagan's own imagination.
It would stop missiles in outer space so they couldn't hit our house.
Well, I have to tell you, SDI, the so-called Star Wars Initiative, was a shock to most of us on the White House staff. We never saw it coming. And it was Reagan being Reagan. It was something he wanted to do, and he didn't want to staff it out.
Although dismissed by most as impractical, it now appears that the Soviets took SDI seriously. Suffering from internal economic problems, Gorbachev knew he couldn't keep up with an arms race in space.
Whatever one thinks about the military merits of it, I think it was a masterstroke diplomatically. It was at that point that the Soviets came to the realization, we can't compete with this. We can't keep up in the arms race. And I think that SDI, in retrospect, hastened the end of the Cold War.
During a 1987 visit to the divided city of Berlin, Reagan put an exclamation point on his rhetorical war against Soviet communism.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I thought it was a joke. I never expected that this daring statement, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, would have any effect. It was just simply rhetoric, words playing to the audience. But then it happened.
By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Ronald Reagan had retired to California. His supporters give Reagan credit for causing both the collapse of the wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union itself a year later.
This idea that Reagan won the Cold War is terribly overblown.
It was Reagan's luck to be in the right place at the right time.
I think the Cold War was won by a succession of Republican and Democratic presidents over a period of 40 years who were willing to stay the course against the expansionist aims of the Soviet Union.
When Ronald Reagan died in June of 2004, he was eulogized as one of the greatest presidents of all time, and some wondered if there was room for one more face on Mount Rushmore. Only time will tell if Reagan joins that elite pantheon. What is clear is that Reagan was a substantial figure in American presidential history, a key player in ending the Cold War, revitalizing the conservative movement, and assuring America that it was still okay to wave the red, white, and blue.